The morning of September 7th, 1940, began with clear skies over London. At 11:57 in the morning, air raid sirens wailed across the East End. Dock workers at the Royal Victoria Dock looked up to see something they had never witnessed before. 348 German bombers flying in formation, escorted by 617 fighters. The formation stretched for miles, a solid mass of aircraft that droned across the English Channel with mechanical precision. Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Hermann, flying a Heinkel He-111 bomber with Kampfgeschwader 4, later described the moment his bomb bay doors opened over the Thames. He could see the docks clearly, the warehouses, the tight-packed residential streets of Silvertown and West Ham. His bombardier released their load, 4 500-pound high-explosive bombs followed by dozens of incendiaries. Hermann watched them fall, tumbling through 3,000 feet of air before impacting among the warehouses. Fires bloomed orange and red across the docklands. Within minutes, smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. The Luftwaffe had come to break Britain through strategic bombing. German crews believed absolutely in the efficacy of their campaign. They had the aircraft, the training, the tactical doctrine developed over years of planning. They had already demonstrated their capability in Warsaw, Rotterdam, and across France. Now they would bring that same devastating power to bear on London, on British industry, on the will of the British people. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What those German crews did not know, could not have known as they turned back toward France that September afternoon, was that they had just initiated a campaign that would eventually be answered with a retaliation so overwhelming, so industrially comprehensive, that it would dwarf their efforts by a factor of nearly 50 to 1. The bombs falling on London that day totaled approximately 300 tons. Before the war ended, the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces would drop 2.7 million tons of bombs on Germany. This is not a story of moral equivalence or of justified revenge. It is a story about industrial capacity, about strategic miscalculation, and about the moment when German military planners realized that the bombing campaign they had initiated would consume their own cities in flames, far more terrible than anything they had inflicted on Britain. It is a story about numbers, about production, about the mathematics of total war between industrial powers, where one side possessed resources the other could never match. The German bombers returning to their bases in occupied France that evening landed with a sense of accomplishment. They had struck a major blow against British morale and capability. The docks were burning. Civilian casualties were significant. The campaign was working exactly as planned. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was confident that Britain would seek terms within weeks, perhaps days. The Luftwaffe had bombed Warsaw into submission in 3 days. Rotterdam had capitulated after a single devastating raid. Why would London be different? What made London different, what made Britain different, was not courage or determination alone, though the British would demonstrate both in abundance during the months ahead. What made Britain different was that it was not alone. Across the Atlantic, the industrial capacity of the United States was beginning to mobilize. In factories throughout Britain itself, production lines were adapting to war footing, and in the minds of strategic planners, a response was already taking shape that would transform strategic bombing from a tactical tool into an instrument of total industrial annihilation. The Blitz, as it would come to be known, was not an improvised campaign. It was the product of strategic thinking that dated back to the early 1930s, when the Luftwaffe was still a clandestine organization operating in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. German military theorists had studied the writings of Italian General Giulio Douhet, who argued that strategic bombing of civilian populations could break enemy morale and win wars without the need for costly ground campaigns. The Luftwaffe's doctrine centered on the concept of terror bombing, combined with precision strikes against military and industrial targets. The Germans had developed a sophisticated bombing force built around medium bombers designed for tactical flexibility. The Heinkel He-111 could carry 4,400 pounds of bombs over a range of 1,500 miles at a cruising speed of 220 miles per hour. The Dornier Do-17, though carrying a smaller bomb load of 2,200 pounds, was faster and more difficult to intercept. The Junkers Ju-88, perhaps the most versatile aircraft in the Luftwaffe inventory, could function as a bomber, dive bomber, night fighter, or reconnaissance aircraft. These aircraft had proven themselves in combat. In September 1939, the Luftwaffe had dropped 560 tons of bombs on Warsaw over 3 days, killing an estimated 25,000 civilians and forcing Polish capitulation. In May 1940, a single raid on Rotterdam killed 900 civilians and destroyed the medieval city centre, leading to Dutch surrender within hours. The pattern seemed clear. Strategic bombing worked. It broke morale, disrupted industry, and forced governments to seek peace. German bomber crews were trained extensively. A typical Luftwaffe bomber pilot received approximately 250 hours of flight training before joining an operational squadron, far more than bomber pilots in most other air forces at that time. Crews trained in navigation, bomb aiming, formation flying, and defensive tactics. They practiced over the Baltic and North Sea, simulating long-range missions. By the time the Blitz began, Luftwaffe bomber crews were among the most experienced and professional in the world. The campaign against Britain began in earnest on September 7, 1940, with that massive daylight raid on London's docks. Over the following months, the Luftwaffe would fly sustained bombing operations against London and other British cities. The raids followed a pattern. Bombers would approach at night, using radio navigation beams to find their targets. Pathfinder aircraft, typically Heinkel He-111s, equipped with X-Gerät or Knickerbeam radio navigation systems, would drop incendiaries to mark the target area. Following waves of bombers would then drop their loads on the fires. The tonnage dropped on Britain during the Blitz was significant by the standards of 1940 and 1941. On the night of December 29, 1940, the Luftwaffe dropped approximately 120 tons of incendiaries and high explosives on the City of London, creating a firestorm that consumed the medieval core. On May 10, 1941, 505 German bombers dropped 711 tons of bombs on London in the heaviest raid of the campaign. The raid killed 1,436 people, injured 1,792, and destroyed or damaged over 11,000 buildings. By the end of May 1941, when the Blitz officially ended as Germany redirected its air power toward the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe had dropped approximately 45,000 tons of bombs on Britain. London had received roughly 23,000 tons. Other cities, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Glasgow, Bristol, Plymouth, had absorbed the remainder. German confidence in strategic bombing rested on several pillars, all of which seemed reasonable given the information available to Luftwaffe planners in 1940. First, they believed that civilian populations would break under sustained aerial attack. The experience of Warsaw and Rotterdam appeared to confirm this. Second, they believed that precision targeting of industrial facilities would cripple British war production. Third, they believed that Britain, isolated and alone after the fall of France, lacked the capacity to respond in kind. This third assumption was critical. Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, sat deep within German territory, far beyond the range of British bombers in 1940. The Royal Air Force's primary bomber at the outbreak of war was the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, which could carry 7,000 pounds of bombs, but had a maximum range of only 1,650 miles and a cruising speed of 165 miles per hour. To reach targets in Western Germany and return required operating at the absolute limits of the aircraft's capability. Deep penetration raids into central Germany were simply impossible. Moreover, the RAF had suffered devastating losses in the early months of the war. During the Battle of France, Bomber Command had attempted daylight raids against German positions and lost aircraft at unsustainable rates to German fighters and flak. A raid on bridges over the Albert Canal on May 10, 1940, saw half the attacking Bristol Blenheims shot down. A daylight raid on Aalborg airfield in Denmark on August 13, 1940, resulted in 11 of 12 Blenheims being destroyed. The losses forced Bomber Command to abandon daylight operations and switch to night bombing, which greatly reduced accuracy. German planners knew all of this. They knew British bombers were inadequate for sustained strategic campaigns. They knew British bomb loads were small. They knew British navigation and bomb-aiming technology was primitive. What they did not know, what they fundamentally failed to grasp, was Britain's access to American industrial capacity and the speed with which that capacity could be mobilized for total war. The foundation of German belief in strategic bombing rested on a calculation that was accurate in 1940, but would become catastrophically wrong by 1943. The calculation was simple. Germany could deliver more bombs to British targets than Britain could deliver to German targets, and this disparity would remain constant or increase over time. German industry, freed from the constraints of Versailles and operating at full war production since 1936, appeared robust. The Luftwaffe possessed approximately 3,000 bombers in September 1940. Britain's Bomber Command had fewer than 500 operational bombers. But this calculation ignored several factors that would prove decisive. It ignored Britain's determination to continue fighting regardless of bombing. It ignored the limitless industrial potential of the United States, which would eventually provide Britain with the means to strike back. Most critically, it ignored the fact that Britain, having been bombed first, would develop a strategic bombing doctrine far more ruthless and comprehensive than anything Germany had conceived. German bomber crews flying over London in those autumn nights of 1940 believed they were winning. They saw the fires, the destruction, the chaos. They returned to bases in France and reported successful missions. Intelligence officers tallied, the tonnage dropped, and the targets hit. Goering assured Hitler that British morale would break, that industry would be crippled, that invasion or surrender would follow inevitably. What they could not see from their cockpits at 12,000 feet was that they had made a fundamental error in strategic calculation, one that would ultimately consume German cities in a firestorm beyond anything London experienced. The Royal Air Force's response to the Blitz began not with overwhelming force but with stubborn defiance and limited means. In September 1940, as German bombs fell on London, Bomber Command could muster perhaps 80 aircraft for a single night's operations against Germany. The bombers available were inadequate for the task. The Vickers Wellington, the most numerous type, carried a maximum bomb load of 4,500 pounds over a range of 1,200 miles. The Handley Page Hampden could carry 4,000 pounds. The Armstrong, Whitworth, Whitley, already described, rounded out the force. These aircraft operated under severe constraints. Navigation at night relied primarily on dead reckoning and celestial navigation using a sextant. Crews would take off from bases in eastern England, fly across the North Sea, attempt to locate their targets in blacked-out Germany, drop their bombs, and return all in darkness, often in bad weather, without the benefit of radio navigation aids that might give away their position to German night fighters. Unsurprisingly, accuracy was abysmal. A study conducted in August 1941, known as the Butt Report after civil servant D.M. Butt, who compiled it, examined photographs taken by bomber crews during raids. The findings were devastating. Only 1 in 3 aircraft claiming to have bombed a target had actually dropped their bombs within 5 miles of it. Over the Ruhr Valley, with its industrial haze and heavy flak defences, only 1 in 10 aircraft bombed within 5 miles of the intended target. Despite these limitations, Bomber Command persisted. The reasoning was partly strategic and partly psychological. Britain needed to strike back at Germany, to demonstrate that it could bring the war to German territory, to maintain morale at home and show solidarity with the Soviet Union after June 1941. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, who became Chief of the Air Staff in October 1940, was a convinced advocate of strategic bombing. He believed that given sufficient resources, Bomber Command could deliver decisive blows against German industry and morale. Portal's vision required aircraft that did not yet exist in quantity. The solution was already in development: 4-engine heavy bombers capable of carrying unprecedented bomb loads deep into German territory. The short Stirling entered service in August 1940, the first of the new generation. It could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs, more than 3 times the payload of a Wellington. The Handley-Page Halifax followed in November 1940 with a similar bomb load and better high-altitude performance. But the aircraft that would truly transform Bomber Command was still in testing, the Avro Lancaster. The Lancaster was a masterpiece of practical design. It emerged from the failure of the Avro Manchester, a twin-engine bomber plagued by unreliable engines. Roy Chadwick, Avro's chief designer, redesigned the Manchester with 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines instead of 2 underpowered Vultures. The result was an aircraft that could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs in its standard configuration, or 22,000 pounds with modifications. Maximum bomb load using a specially modified bomb bay could reach 22,000 pounds for a single massive bomb. Range with a typical bomb load was 1,660 miles. Cruising speed was 200 miles per hour. Most importantly, it was reliable, relatively easy to fly, and could absorb significant battle damage and still bring its crew home. The Lancaster entered service with Bomber Command in February 1942. Production ramped up quickly. By the end of 1942, 400 230 Lancasters had been delivered. In 1943, production reached 2,630 aircraft. By 1944, Lancaster production peaked at 3,939 aircraft delivered in a single year. The factories producing them: A. V. Rowe in Manchester, Metropolitangent Vickers, Armstrong Whitworth, Austin Motors. Vickers Armstrong operated multiple shifts around the clock. Women comprised a significant portion of the workforce, performing every job from riveting to electrical work to final assembly. The Lancaster gave Bomber Command the tool it needed to implement a new strategic bombing doctrine, one that would make the German Blitz look restrained by comparison. But the Lancaster alone was not sufficient. What transformed strategic bombing from harassment raids into systematic destruction was the combination of British 4-engine bombers, American industrial production, and a willingness to embrace area bombing as official policy. In February 1942, the Air Ministry issued a directive to Bomber Command that fundamentally changed the nature of the air war. The directive, issued on February 14th, stated that operations should now be focused on the morale of the enemy civil population and in particular of industrial workers. This was bureaucratic language for what would become known as area bombing, the deliberate targeting of city centres to destroy housing, kill workers, and break German morale through terror. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris took command of Bomber Command on February 22, 1942. Harris was a convinced advocate of strategic bombing, who believed that Germany could be defeated by air power alone, without the need for a costly invasion of continental Europe. He embraced the area bombing directive without reservation. Under his command, Bomber Command would evolve from a force conducting harassment raids into an instrument of systematic urban destruction. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 transformed the strategic bombing campaign from a British effort of limited scope into an industrial undertaking of unprecedented scale. The United States Army Air Forces brought not just aircraft and crews, but an industrial production capacity that dwarfed anything Germany could match. American bomber production centered on 2 aircraft, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The B-17, already in service before Pearl Harbor, was a 4-engine heavy bomber designed for high-altitude precision daylight bombing. It could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs over a range of 2,000 miles at a cruising speed of 182 miles per hour. Its defensive armament was formidable, 13 .50 caliber machine guns in various positions, giving it firepower that German fighter pilots learned to respect. The aircraft could operate at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet above much of the German flak. The B-24 complemented the B-17 with slightly better range and a higher bomb load of 12,800 pounds, though it was more difficult to fly and less able to absorb battle damage. Both aircraft were produced in quantities that reflected American industrial might. Boeing's Seattle plant produced B-17s at an accelerating rate throughout the war. But Seattle was just one facility. Douglas Aircraft Company in Long Beach, California, built B-17s under license. Lockheed's Vega subsidiary in Burbank built them. The Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, devoted its entire production to the bomber. By 1944, these factories collectively produced 375 B-17s per month. Total B-17 production, from 1939 to 1945, reached 12,731 aircraft. The B-24 was produced in even larger numbers. Consolidated's San Diego facility built them. Douglas in Tulsa built them. Ford Motor Company constructed an entirely new facility at Willow Run, Michigan, specifically to mass-produce B-24s using automobile assembly line techniques. The Willow Run plant was the largest single manufacturing facility in the world at the time, covering 3.5 million square feet. At peak production in 1944, Willow Run produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. Total B-24 production reached 18,482 aircraft, making it the most produced American military aircraft of World War II. These production numbers meant that the United States could replace losses at rates that Germany could never match. If Bomber Command or the U.S. 8th Air Force lost 50 aircraft in a single raid, a catastrophic loss rate, American factories would replace them within days. German factories, operating under increasingly difficult conditions as the war progressed, could not sustain such losses. The American approach to strategic bombing differed from the British. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, conducted daylight precision bombing raids, targeting specific industrial facilities, ball-bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries, aircraft factories, marshalling yards. The theory was that destroying key bottleneck industries would cripple German war production more effectively than area bombing. American crews flew in formation, using massed defensive firepower from their heavy machine guns to protect themselves against fighter attacks. The Norden bomb sight, a sophisticated mechanical computer, theoretically allowed bombs to be dropped with precision from high altitude. In practice, precision bombing proved nearly as inaccurate as British night bombing, particularly when cloud cover obscured targets or when German fighter attacks disrupted formations. Nevertheless, the Americans persisted with daylight operations, suffering horrendous losses in the process. The raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg on August 17, 1943, saw the 8th Air Force lose 60 B-17s out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate of 16%. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, was even worse. 60 B-17s lost out of 291 dispatched, a loss rate exceeding 20%. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. These losses were unsustainable, but they were sustained because American production could absorb them. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids until long-range fighter escorts became available, then resumed operations with even larger forces. By late 1944, the 8th Air Force could dispatch 1,000 bombers on a single mission, escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustang fighters with the range to accompany the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The combined British and American strategic bombing campaign reached its crescendo in 1944 and 1945, and the numbers reveal the staggering disparity between what Germany had done to Britain and what the Allies did to Germany in return. In 1943, the Royal Air Force dropped 157,000 tons of bombs on Germany and occupied Europe. The US 8th and 15th Air Forces dropped 44,000 tons. Total, 201,000 tons in a single year, more than 4 times the entire German blitz against Britain. In 1944, the tonnage escalated dramatically. The RAF dropped 525,000 tons. American forces dropped 589,000 tons. Total, 1.114 million tons in a single year. In 1945, Despite Germany's surrender in early May, the RAF dropped 181,000 tons in the first 4 months of the year. American forces dropped 188,000 tons. Even in this truncated year, the Allies dropped 369,000 tons. The cumulative total from 1940 through 1945, the Royal Air Force dropped approximately 955,000 tons of bombs on Germany and occupied territories. The United States Army Air Forces dropped approximately 1.61 million tons, combined total approximately 2.57 million tons, even accounting for variations in how different sources calculate tonnage, whether they include bombs dropped on targets in occupied France, Italy, and elsewhere. The total approaches or exceeds 2.7 million tons. This was 50 to 60 times the tonnage Germany dropped on Britain during the Blitz. These numbers represented more than statistical disparity. They represented industrial annihilation on a scale unprecedented in human warfare. Every ton of bombs required raw materials to manufacture, factories to produce them, railways to transport them, ports to ship them, airfields to store them, and aircraft to deliver them. The Allies constructed this entire industrial and logistical apparatus while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple continents, while supplying the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, while building the world's largest navy, while developing the atomic bomb. Germany, by contrast, could not match this production while defending itself on multiple fronts. German industry in 1944 produced approximately 1.9 million tons of ammunition of all types, artillery shells, bombs, small arms rounds, everything. The Allies dropped more bomb tonnage on Germany in 1944 than Germany produced in total ammunition. The effect on German cities was catastrophic. Hamburg, attacked in Operation Gomorrah from July 24 to August 3, 1943, experienced a firestorm that killed approximately 42,600 people in a single night, July 27 to 28. The attack involved 791 RAF aircraft, dropping 2,300 tons of bombs, including large quantities of incendiaries that created a self-sustaining firestorm with winds reaching 150 miles per hour and temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Dresden, attacked on February 13 to 15, 1945, experienced similar devastation. RAF Bomber Command dispatched 722 aircraft on the night of February 13 to 14, dropping approximately 1,478 tons of high explosives and 1,182 tons of incendiaries. A second wave of 529 aircraft followed shortly after, dropping another 1,800 tons. The U.S. 8th Air Force added daylight raids on February 14th and 15th with over 500 B-17s dropping an additional 2,800 tons. The firestorm killed an estimated 25,000 people, though exact casualties remain disputed. Berlin, the target of 16 major RAF raids between November 1943 and March 1944, in what became known as the Battle of Berlin, absorbed approximately 45,000 tons of bombs during that period alone. The sustained campaign killed an estimated 20,000 to 50,000 civilians and destroyed over 1.5 million dwellings, leaving approximately 1.5 million Berliners homeless. Cologne, the target of the first 1,000-bomber raid, on May 30th to 31st, 1942, when 1,047 aircraft dropped 1,455 tons of bombs, experienced repeated attacks throughout the war. By war's end, Cologne had been hit by approximately 262 air raids that dropped approximately 44,900 tons of bombs, destroying approximately 70% of the medieval city centre. The pattern repeated across Germany. Essen, Dortmund, Düsseldorf, Frankfurt, Munich, Nuremberg, Stuttgart, every major city experienced systematic destruction from the air. The cumulative effect was the near-complete devastation of urban Germany. For German civilians and military personnel who had witnessed the Blitz and believed in the efficacy of strategic bombing, the reversal was psychologically devastating. Luftwaffe crews who had flown over London in 1940 found themselves, by 1943 and 1944, fighting desperately to defend German skies against bomber streams numbering in the hundreds and then thousands of aircraft. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot who flew throughout the war, recorded his experiences in a diary later published as "I Flew for the Führer." His entries from 1944 reveal the progression of realization. On January 11, 1944, he wrote of intercepting a formation of over 600 American bombers, escorted by fighters. His unit, Jagdgeschwader 11, managed to shoot down several bombers, but lost multiple aircraft in the process. The entry concluded with a simple observation: there are too many of them. By March 1944, after witnessing raids on Berlin, Brunswick, and other cities, Noak's diary entries reflected growing despair. He described watching streams of British bombers passing overhead at night, too many to engage effectively, dropping their loads on cities below, while German night fighters managed to intercept only a fraction of the attacking force. He noted that for every bomber shot down, the Allies seemed to send 10 more the next night. The mathematical impossibility of the situation was obvious to anyone paying attention. German civilians in targeted cities experienced the bombing not as isolated raids, but as sustained campaigns of destruction that lasted months and sometimes years. Mathilde Wolff-Munkeberg, a Hamburg resident whose letters to her children in England survived the war, described the aftermath of the July 1943 firestorm. She wrote of streets filled with carbonized corpses, of basements where entire families had suffocated when the firestorm consumed all oxygen, of survivors wandering through destroyed neighborhoods trying to locate where their homes had once stood. Her letter dated August 1, 1943, contained a single devastating observation: "We did this to others first, and now it has come back to us 100-fold." This recognition that Germany had initiated strategic bombing and was now experiencing retaliation far beyond what it had inflicted appeared frequently in documents and testimony. From the period, Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, later testified at Nuremberg that he had warned Hitler as early as June 1944 that the air war was lost and that Germany's industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed. Speer noted that German leadership had failed to anticipate the scale of Allied bombing because they had vastly underestimated Allied industrial capacity. The disparity extended beyond tonnage to technology and tactics. By late 1944, RAF Bomber Command employed sophisticated electronic navigation and targeting aids that the Luftwaffe had never developed. The oboe system, introduced in late 1942, used radio transponders to guide Pathfinder aircraft to targets with accuracy measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. The H-2S radar, installed in bombers beginning in early 1943, allowed crews to navigate and identify targets through cloud cover and darkness. These systems gave Allied bombers capability far beyond what the Luftwaffe had possessed during the Blitz. German air defences, despite technological innovations of their own, could not cope with the scale of attacks. The Kammhuber line, an integrated system of radar stations, searchlights, and night fighter zones established to defend against RAF night bombing, was systematically overwhelmed. RAF Bomber Command introduced bomber stream tactics, concentrating aircraft into a narrow corridor of time and space that saturated defensive sectors. The introduction of window strips of aluminum foil dropped by bombers to create false radar echoes in July 1943 rendered German radar-directed flak and night fighters temporarily ineffective. German fighter production increased dramatically in 1944, reaching approximately 40,000 aircraft of all types. But this surge came too late and consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere. Fuel shortages, caused partly by Allied bombing of synthetic oil plants, meant that new fighters often sat on airfields unable to fly. Experienced pilots, killed at unsustainable rates in combat against Allied fighters, could not be replaced quickly enough. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had aircraft but lacked fuel and trained pilots to operate them effectively. The realization among German military leadership That the air war was irretrievably lost came gradually through 1943 and early 1944, then became undeniable after the Normandy invasion, when the Allies demonstrated total air superiority over the battlefield. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, wrote to Hitler in July 1944 describing the impossibility of conducting operations under constant Allied air attack. His letter stated that German troops and vehicles could not move in daylight without being attacked by fighter bombers, that supply lines were being systematically destroyed, and that air superiority alone made the military situation untenable. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany remains one of the most controversial aspects of Allied conduct during World War II. Post-war analyses have debated whether the campaign was militarily effective, whether it hastened Germany's defeat, and whether the civilian casualties inflicted were justified by military necessity. These debates continue among historians, but certain facts are indisputable. First, the campaign consumed enormous German resources that would otherwise have been directed toward the Eastern Front or other theatres. German flak defences required approximately 1 million personnel and consumed approximately one-third of all German artillery and optical production. These guns, ammunition, and personnel could have been deployed against Soviet forces but instead remained in Germany defending cities. The Luftwaffe maintained substantial fighter forces in Germany for air defense throughout 1943, 1944, and into 1945, forces that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front. Second, the campaign systematically destroyed German industrial capacity, particularly in 1944 and 1945. The attacks on synthetic oil plants were particularly effective. Germany began the war heavily dependent on synthetic fuel produced through the Fischer-Tropsch process at large industrial plants. These plants were vulnerable to precision bombing. Beginning in May 1944, the Allies made synthetic oil production a priority target. By September 1944, German fuel production had fallen to approximately 35% of May levels. By March 1945, production had effectively ceased. This fuel shortage crippled the Luftwaffe, limited panzer operations, and contributed directly to Germany's military collapse. Third, the campaign killed between 350,000 and 600,000 German civilians, depending on which scholarly estimates one accepts. The British Official History, published in 1961, estimated approximately 300,000 deaths. German historians have suggested figures as high as 600,000, though scholarly consensus generally accepts figures in the 400,000 to 500,000 range. These casualties represented approximately 0.5% of Germany's pre-war population, a devastating toll by any measure. Fourth, the campaign destroyed approximately 3.6 million dwelling units in Germany, approximately 20% of the total housing stock. This created a massive refugee crisis within Germany itself, with millions of civilians displaced from destroyed cities, seeking shelter elsewhere. The economic cost of reconstruction after the war was immense, though Germany's recovery, aided by the Marshall Plan and economic reforms, was remarkably rapid. The effectiveness of strategic bombing in shortening the war remains debated. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war by teams of economists, statisticians, and military analysts, concluded that strategic bombing had been decisive in defeating Germany. The survey noted that German war production had peaked in July 1944 despite years of bombing, but argued that production would have been much higher without the bombing campaign, and that the disruption of transportation networks in late 1944 and early 1945 had effectively paralyzed the German economy. Critics of strategic bombing, including some military historians, argue that the resources devoted to building and operating bomber forces could have been used more effectively in other ways, that precision attacks on specific bottleneck industries would have been more effective than area bombing of cities, and that the civilian casualties inflicted served no military purpose and may have stiffened German resistance rather than breaking morale. These debates acknowledge valid points on both sides, but they sometimes obscure a simpler truth that was obvious to participants at the time. The strategic bombing campaign demonstrated with brutal clarity the industrial disparity between the Allies and Germany. The 2.7 million tons of bombs dropped on Germany represented not just explosive power, but industrial capacity, organizational skill, technological innovation, and resource availability that Germany could never match. When the war ended in May 1945, German cities lay in ruins. Aerial photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft in the final weeks of the war show urban landscapes transformed into fields of rubble. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Frankfurt, city after city, showed the same pattern of near-total destruction in central areas, with damage extending outward in concentric circles corresponding to the intensity of bombing. The human cost of this destruction extended beyond immediate casualties. Survivors faced years of privation in destroyed cities lacking adequate housing, sanitation, or services. The winter of 1945 to 1946, particularly harsh throughout Europe, saw German civilians living in basements and ruins, scavenging for food and fuel, surviving under conditions that approached those experienced in heavily damaged areas of the Soviet Union. The occupation authorities faced a humanitarian crisis that required immediate intervention to prevent mass starvation and disease. The physical reconstruction of German cities took decades. Some cities, like Dresden, chose to preserve ruins as memorials. Others, like Frankfurt and Cologne, rebuilt quickly in modern styles that erased much of their pre-war architectural character. The economic cost of reconstruction was offset by the Marshall Plan, which provided approximately $13 billion in aid to Western Europe, with West Germany receiving approximately $1.4 billion. This aid, combined with currency reform and economic liberalization, enabled rapid recovery. By the late 1950s, West Germany's economy had recovered to pre-war production levels and was growing rapidly. The strategic bombing campaign left a complex legacy for post-war air power doctrine. The United States Air Force, established as an independent service in 1947, embraced strategic bombing as its central mission. The development of nuclear weapons seemed to validate the concept that wars could be won through air power alone. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War rested on the assumption that strategic bombing with nuclear weapons would be so devastating that no rational leader would initiate war. Yet conventional strategic bombing continued to prove less decisive than its advocates claimed. In Korea, massive bombing campaigns failed to force North Korea to terms. In Vietnam, Rolling Thunder and linebacker operations dropped millions of tons of bombs without achieving strategic victory. In later conflicts, the Gulf War, the Kosovo campaign, Iraq, Afghanistan, precision-guided munitions allowed genuinely accurate targeting of specific facilities. But even these campaigns demonstrated that air power alone rarely achieves decisive strategic effects without ground forces. For Britain, the strategic bombing campaign raised moral questions that have never been fully resolved. The policy of area bombing, deliberately targeting civilian populations, conflicted with pre-war British assertions that such bombing was a war crime. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, who directed Bomber Command through most of the war and presided over the most destructive raids, was never given a peerage after the war, unlike other major commanders. When a statue of Harris was unveiled in London in 1992, it provoked controversy and protests. The moral ambiguity of area bombing remains a subject of debate in Britain. The Germans who survived the bombing campaign carried psychological scars that influenced post-war German culture and politics. The experience of total defeat, of having cities destroyed by an enemy whose industrial might was overwhelming, contributed to post-war German pacifism and reluctance to use military force. The generation that experienced the bombing became deeply committed to European integration and peaceful resolution of conflicts, viewing the destruction they had witnessed as the ultimate consequence of militarism and nationalism. Returning to that morning of September 7, 1940, when German bombers first appeared over London in formation, the irony is inescapable. The Luftwaffe crews who opened their bomb bay doors and released 300 tons of bombs on the London docks initiated a campaign that would ultimately bring 2.7 million tons of bombs down on Germany. The ratio, approximately 9,000 to 1, represents not just a military miscalculation, but a fundamental misunderstanding of industrial warfare between modern nations. The German bombers that morning were well-designed aircraft flown by experienced crews executing a carefully planned operation. They succeeded in their immediate tactical objectives. The docks burned, casualties were inflicted, disruption was achieved. But the strategic implications of that raid, the decision to initiate city bombing against an enemy with access to resources Germany could never match, would prove catastrophic for Germany. The mathematics of the situation were clear to anyone who examined them objectively. The United States produced more than Germany, Britain, and Japan combined across virtually every category of military equipment. American factories built nearly 300,000 aircraft during the war. German factories built approximately 120,000. British factories built approximately 130,000. In bomber production specifically, American factories built over 97,000 bombers of all types. German factories built approximately 18,000. This 4-to-1 production ratio in bombers meant that even accounting for losses, the Allies could sustain operations at levels Germany could never match. The story of strategic bombing in World War II is ultimately a story about industrial capacity and the consequences of initiating total war against an enemy possessing overwhelming material superiority. The German bombers over London in September 1940 demonstrated what a mid-sized industrial power could accomplish with well-trained forces and good equipment. The Allied bombers over Germany in 1944 and 1945 demonstrated what true industrial superpowers could accomplish when fully mobilized for total war. For the crews on both sides, German bomber crews over London in 1940, British and American bomber crews over Germany in 1944, the experience of strategic bombing was one of the most dangerous assignments of the war. RAF Bomber Command suffered 55,573 killed out of approximately 125,000 aircrew, who served a death rate exceeding 44%. The U.S. 8th Air Force lost approximately 26,000 killed. German bomber crews who survived long enough to witness the reversal of fortunes saw their own cities destroyed by a force they could not stop, carrying out a campaign they themselves had initiated. The legacy of those raids continues to shape how we think about warfare, about the limits of military force, about the relationship between industrial capacity and military power, and about the human cost of strategic decisions made by political leaders. The 2.7 million tons of bombs dropped on Germany began with those first 300 tons dropped on London. And in that progression lies a lesson about escalation, retaliation, and the ultimate futility of attempting to win wars through the terrorization of civilian populations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.